Well, welcome everybody. This is the fourth event in our series for this AHRC research network. We're calling the Scottish Magazines Network. This session is focused on the past and present of Scottish independent media, especially political media. And what we're trying to do in this session is join some dots and compare some notes between the period of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s and 90s and the contemporary scene. So this project is predominantly interested in small cultural and political magazines of the past 50 years. But we're curious to know what we can learn about these magazines today, how they helped to produce today and our contemporary Scottish cultural, political, and media scene, and then to ask some practitioners in the current Scottish media for their reflections on some of these titles, making that comparison again between then and now. Just a quick word on what this network is all about. We are a group of scholars drawn across fields of Scottish literature, history, politics, and publishing. The whole goal of this is to revive interest in titles like the ones you're going to see on the screen. We want to explore and recirculate Scotland's independent magazine culture from the 60s to the 90s, although we're not too strict about those boundaries in time. We've got a whole bunch of blogs, podcasts, and events. We're kind of coming toward the end of our program, but we have plans to extend some of this activity, not least through digitization, and there will be a scholarly book that emerges from this process as well. If you get the chance, please do check out the project homepage. The link is on the screen there. There's a lot of really interesting material already. The most recent blog we published was exploring the role of magazines, or the idea really of a magazine, in online literary culture today. So quite a lot of this scene plays around somewhat ironically with the conventions of the literary magazine in an online medium. And that's an interesting way of thinking about the form and style of the magazine and its function within literary culture. Quite a lot of the other material on the blog is focused a bit closer to what we're talking about today, namely political magazines and the way they bring Scottish culture and politics together. So we've got some podcasts and profiles of individual magazines that are well worth your trouble if this is the sort of thing you're interested in. In bringing things together today, I thought I would just unearth a few images to try and get my own mind focused, and hopefully it'll stimulate a few of you as well. These are some covers and some adverts for magazines drawn right across the 1960s to the 1990s. And there was just a couple of things I wanted to draw out of this, perhaps to begin us thinking about then and now. And the first is that these small independent magazines published on a shoestring, often by students, were actually a very important means of communicating and debating political issues in the 1960s and 70s. Some of the best coverage of the tortuous process of negotiating some kind of devolution offer in the 1970s can be found in magazines like New Edinburgh Review. You can see other small radical magazines like Calgacus pursuing similar questions from a more radical position in the political and cultural scene. And it wasn't just devotedly political magazines, but also cultural magazines, poetry magazines, literary magazines, in which some of these political currents were aired and ventilated. You have an issue of Edinburgh Review there from 1999 where various Scottish writers are asking themselves what the new parliament might mean for Scottish culture. The image toward the center there are a series of ads from an issue of Radical Scotland in 1987 that I find quite interesting, because one of the things we're attuned to is the way in which magazines are not just organs of communication. They're also means of organization. People are connecting politically, socially, ideologically through these magazines in ways that have real consequences in building particular movements, pursuing particular social aims, and then most centrally, the aim of political devolution itself. You can see just in this one issue of Radical Scotland, there's ads for the campaign for a Scottish Assembly, Other similar magazines also published at the University of Edinburgh, like Contrastus and New Edinburgh Review, Gay Scotland, and of course an advertising notice for the magazine itself in Radical Scotland. One thing I wanted to highlight is the fact that many of these magazines are conscious of the fact that they are part of a change in media production. There were obviously a whole host of broad economic and technological changes that transformed the media in every country, not just in Scotland. And we should bear that in mind here. The rise of the internet is clearly the most important thing that happened between then and now. And it's interesting to note that changing media structures and modes are a real source of interest in these early magazines. So Scottish International from January 1968 starts out as a magazine that has media right there in its strapline. Arts, media, environment. It's part funded by STV, and the main editor, Bob Tate, is extremely interested in the medium of television. You can see even from that first issue, there are questions of media right at the forefront of what is being considered. Publishing crisis, TV lives, the role of theater and classical music in a society of new mass cultural media. Harpies and Quines comes from a later period, the 1990s, and I'll let Lesley Riddoch tell you the story of this extraordinary magazine. That's another very determined intervention. People who are unhappy with the state of the Scottish media and are going to do something about it. That's probably something you could connect with Radical Scotland, which is both a media project and a political project where people are more or less consciously putting together a kind of coalition to carve out a new space or create a new political consensus that is going to change not only the political sphere in Scotland, but also the media sphere. This is a useful issue to highlight because it probably had the greatest impact for this relatively small magazine. People still talk about the doomsday scenario that is advertised on the cover. This was the idea that pretty soon the Conservatives were going to collide with their dominance in British elections that lacked any legitimacy based on their share of Scottish votes. So I'm just throwing a few ideas at the wall here to get us thinking about how self-conscious these magazines were in their own thinking about media. There's, of course, abundant grumbling about the BBC and broadcasting and the state of the Scottish press. And that has, of course, become a much more acute issue in recent times. But the prompts that I gave to our speakers run like this, and they're fairly straightforward. It's very open-ended. We just want to consider how Scottish media and politics have changed over the past few decades, and to think about where these magazines might fit into that story. We can ask what kind of role magazines like the ones I've mentioned, Contrastus, Radical Scotland, Q, Harpies and Quines, and so on, what role do they play in changing Scotland, or at least the arena of political debate? And then thinking about the contemporary scene, do we see much role for print magazines today doing what those earlier titles achieved? I can think of many, many obstacles to setting up a print magazine that would try and emulate these. It would far more likely be a blog or a podcast today. But what does that shift mean? Can you do the same things with a blog or a podcast? Does it have the same social and organizing impact that a magazine does? Because a magazine can function almost like a small political party, subject to all the same divisions, pressures, and clashes. But to kick things off, I thought I would actually finally refer to this image at the top right of the slide, which is advertising an event that sounds a little bit like this one. In 1987, the title of this event was called The Radical Media, Who Needs It and Who Reads It? A discussion event taking place in Partick. The speakers are Alan Lawson of Radical Scotland and Willie Thompson of Marxism Today. So these are very long-standing questions that small independent media producers are thinking about. Where does radical media fit within a larger public and political sphere? But of course, technological change and the rise of devolution and its political institutions probably changes the nature of some of those questions about what counts as radical media and what audiences it might reach. So with that, I'm going to be quiet now and hand over to our speakers. Our first speaker is Jamie Maxwell, and I'm sure none of these people need very much introducing to this audience. Jamie is a journalist, writer, and editor whose work appears regularly in Politico and New Left Review. And he also edited with Pete Remand a collection of Tom Nairn's writings published with Lewis in 2014. So Jamie, could you start us off? You're muted, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Hello everyone, and thank you Scott and Alice for arranging this fascinating event and inviting me to take part. I think my initial response whenever I'm asked to talk about the state of the Scottish media landscape is one of wearied pessimism, and that pessimism reflects both the structural realities of the landscape in the form of ongoing redundancies and foreign ownership and crashing circulation rates, and my own personal experiences of it. I've been writing professionally about Scottish politics for the past 10 years. I got my start in journalism contributing to now defunct publications like the Sunday Herald and the Scottish Review of Books. So in a strange inverse sort of way, I feel like my professional development has tracked Scotland's domestic newspaper industry during the most acute phase of its decline. And of course, that decline has come at a particularly bad moment for the country as a whole, as the debate over independence has intensified and the need for proper critical scrutiny of our institutions has intensified along with it. However, I also think there's a tendency that Scott has sort of alluded to among Scottish journalists and people involved in Scottish public life to dwell too much on the failures of the Scottish media, failures that are well rehearsed and long-standing. We're all familiar with the hyper-partisan reporting of the mainstream press, the superficial political commentary, and the endless, pointless Twitter controversies. But beneath the surface, and very much against the odds, there is a massive amount of first-rate independent journalism happening in Scotland. Journalism that sits, in my view, within the broad tradition of the radical magazines of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s that we are discussing today. Some of the publications I'm thinking of includes Mike Small's Bella Caledonia, which functions as a much-needed point of focus for Scotland's political and cultural life. The Ferret, which consistently breaks major investigative stories, and Nutmeg magazine, which publishes high-quality long-form sports reporting. For me, the existence of these publications gives lie to the idea that there is no serious, credible, or viable independent media in Scotland. And more importantly, it gives lie to the belief, found on both extremes of the constitutional spectrum, that Scotland is somehow uniquely lacking in good journalism. That just clearly isn't the case. Moreover, the fundamentals of Scotland's media crisis are not distinctive to Scotland. I lived in Vancouver for a few years, and while I was there, not only did I encounter plenty of young Canadian journalists whose professional lives were every bit as precarious as mine, but I remember reading quite regularly about mass layoffs and restructuring at major Canadian titles. So in addition to not being overly pessimistic about the state of Scottish journalism, I think we should also avoid pathologizing the problems that exist within the Scottish public sphere. Our media is definitely inadequate and could definitely be better, but the media is inadequate everywhere and could be better everywhere. And to that extent, I think much of the hand-wringing that goes on over the relationship between Scotland's political status and its media and the strength of its democracy doesn't serve much useful purpose. Which brings me to the issue at hand, the impact and legacy of publications like Scottish International Review, Question Magazine, and Radical Scotland. I've spent the last few days rummaging through old back copies of these titles, and one of the things I was struck by was the consistency of the editorial themes. Alongside big set-piece articles on Scotland's constitutional future and the strength of the labour movement in Scotland, sit more reflective pieces of foreign reportage and cultural criticism. The underlying editorial message always seems to be the same, that the Scottish perspective matters, that it deserves to be taken seriously, and that it is no less nuanced or cosmopolitan than that offered by any major progressive English or American publication. Indeed, Question Magazine, which ran for about 4 years from the mid to late 1970s, consciously cast itself as a Scottish alternative to the New Statesman. And for a while, given the heavyweight contributions of writers like Neil Acheson and Tom Nairn, it could credibly claim that position. Scott Ames, Rory Scorthorne and Ben Jackson have all written in detail about the pivotal role these magazines played in helping to construct or cohere some of the core myths of Scotland's contemporary political life, the myth of Scotland's inherently anti-conservative character, for instance. And you can certainly see when you flick through the pages of these publications, that process of construction taking place. Equally, the overarching tone of the magazines, and of Question Magazine in particular, is one of irreverent self-criticism. Anything and everything Scottish, as well as anything and everything British, is open to ridicule and critique. That might reflect the breakdown of post-war social norms that was taking place in the 1970s, or it might reflect the overwhelming intellectual and stylistic influence of Tom Nairn on a generation of Scottish writers and thinkers. Either way, I think that irreverence remains one of the chief characteristics of Scotland's independent media today. It is evident in Bella Caledonia's uncompromising political commentary, and it is evident in the Ferret's pleasingly ruthless investigations into devolutionary Scotland's power networks. Some things have changed since the 1970s and 80s. As noted, it's all too easy to thumb through a copy of Question Magazine, for instance, and find an exclusively white male writing staff. This is something I don't think a publication could or would try to get away with in Scotland in the 2020s. The recent demise of the Scottish Review of Books being a stark case in point. Today's patchwork of independent media outlets probably enjoys a wider reach too. In her excellent blog on the Scottish Magazine Network's website, Charlotte Lauder notes that not only did publications like Question Magazine and Radical Scotland often publish the same contributors issue after issue, but those contributors also often formed the core readership of the publications. At its height in the late 1970s, Question Magazine was read by 8,000 or 9,000 people every month. Bella Caledonia's Twitter account, on the other hand, has 50,000 followers. And Mike has published literally hundreds of different writers over the course of his editorship. Other things remain depressingly consistent. The publications of the 1970s and 80s were chronically underfunded and relied on the voluntary efforts of a handful of writers and editors. None were as prominent as they should have been, and none lasted as long as they should have. In that sense, it's not hard to see the parallels with today's independent media landscape. Lamenting the demise of Question Magazine in 1977, Neil Acheson noted that the title circulation had plunged to a sickening 1,500 copies per month. It was unbelievable, Acheson wrote, that in the most important decade of its recent history, at the moment when the country should be alive with fateful debates, Scotland can't support one serious political review. Given the ongoing absence of a properly funded weekly or bi-weekly Scottish political magazine equivalent in scale and production value to something like the London Review of Books or the New Yorker, that sentence could almost certainly be written word for word again today. I'm not convinced, however, that a major glossy new Scottish publication would significantly improve the quality of Scottish political coverage or of Scottish public debate. For one thing, the LRB regularly and the New Yorker irregularly already publishes superb, in-depth pieces on Scottish politics and culture. And there's nothing wrong with Scottish writers publishing their work in non-Scottish publications. For another, there's a risk that a title along the lines of a Scottish New Statesman would be quickly co-opted into the mainstream and end up repeating the mistakes of the mainstream Scottish press, either by being too generic or too sectarian, or by offering a platform to the same stale voices that have dominated the Scottish commentariat for the past 2 or 3 decades. Instead, I think what we need is comprehensive funding, preferably through a system of public subsidies for a diverse, oppositional, or fragmented independent Scottish media. That funding should be used to pay journalists and editors properly. It should be used to expand and upgrade existing platforms, and it should be used to encourage the emergence of new titles that cultivate new talent and weird, unconventional perspectives. I realise the idea of a publicly funded grassroots democratic Scottish media sounds more than a bit delusional and utopian, but the resources, the infrastructure and the professional insight is already pretty much in place. More to the point, there wouldn't currently be any independent media landscape to speak of had a previous generation of Scottish journalists capitulated to the bleak, provincial and self-fulfilling narratives of Scottish cultural decline. Scotland's independent publications may be niche and they may all too often be temporary, but we know from the example set by the magazines of the 70s, 80s and 90s that they can also be profoundly effective and influential. I suppose the central challenge from here on out is to make them sustainable.
Thank you, Jamie. Some really sharp and pointed comments on possible futures and also questioning some of the narratives of decline that seem to always be in the mix when we talk about developments in the Scottish media. Here's a sign of the times. I'm trying to trace Lesley Riddoch via her Twitter account. She is such a busy media operator. I can see she is tweeting about some of her other broadcasting and podcasting activity, but I haven't been able to entice her back into this particular chat. So I'm hoping we will, in due course, get the benefit of Lesley's insights. She has a lot to share, particularly about the magazine Harpies and Quines. So we'll hope to come back to that. Well, at various points in Jamie's opening comments, he referred to Bella Caledonia and to Mike Small. Perhaps this is a moment to move directly on to Mike's chat, and then we'll get into questions as we go on. Mike is a writer, activist, and the editor of Bella Caledonia, which is, I think, very clearly the inheritor of the sorts of independent political and cultural media that we're talking about today. And the fact that there is really one clearinghouse that consolidated that world is either a sign of health or fragility. Perhaps these 70s and 80s magazines were always better off trying to configure themselves as a one-stop shop for this kind of media, because there is something, I think, fairly sturdy and sustainable about Bella Caledonia and its model. That's enough of my speculation. Let's turn over to Mike Small and hear from the editor.
Hi, thanks, Scott. Can people hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks. It's really interesting to hear Jamie's account and not all of those publications I'd heard of. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Red Herring and product magazines and a bit of the context to that. Red Herring magazine launched in January 1999. Here's the inaugural issue. And Product magazine launched in December 99, January of the new millennium. And they were publications that I was part of. And there is a sort of continuity of that work and to what became Bella Caledonia. And we, the people involved in those magazines, were certainly aware of Radical Scotland under Kevin Dunyan, which ran from 1983 to 1991, and Calgacus, which ran under the editorialship of Ray Burnett, which ran from 1975, not for very long, I think only for a year and a bit, and Scottish International, which ran from 68 to 71, and the Edinburgh Review under Peter Kravitz and Murdo MacDonald, which ran from 1984 to the present day. And here's some editions of the Edinburgh Review, which we thought was inspiring in some ways. I think also this was the time of Indie Media and Indie Media Scotland, which was the new platform that grew out of the massive anti-capitalist demos of the late 90s. Indie Media, Indie Media, I think, formed in November of 99 in response to the Seattle demonstration, which was absolutely huge. And I think it was the frustration that there'd be a demonstration with 100 or 200,000 people on it, and the mainstream press would cover the anarchists that did in the McDonald's or something, and the coverage was so partial. So the technology was emerging. So Red Herring was launched and was immediately buried by our distributors because they said there was some other American magazine that they had called Red Herring that was a sort of tech magazine that nobody had ever heard of. So we had to change the name. And we went away and came up with Product. And I remember in the very first issue, we had an arts page and we had an artist who did a piece which was kind of radical act that he did, and he was called Scott Miles, and he would steal magazines out of John Menzies and redistribute them somewhere else and put inserts of commentary into magazines and stuff. And so he published this in our first issue. And of course, our distributor went went bonkers and it all collapsed and it was a disaster. But I think that is one of the most obvious differences between here and now, as we're reflecting on this, is that John Menzies had a complete monopoly on distribution and would take 45% of any cover price, which made it extremely difficult for small independent magazines to really grow into a sizable profile. So with this example of Scott Miles Pierce, it also shows that we were kind of veering desperately between trying to be professional publications, but also being radical publishers and working with artists who were doing that work. But I mean, the truth is we didn't really know what we were doing. We were young journalists trying to run a business for the first time, to run a publication, to become publishers, and we didn't really know what we were doing. We got a grant of £70,000 from the Scottish Arts Council, and we thought that we were made, that we thought that was that was transformationary. Clearly it wasn't. So those are some of the political magazines that we were inspired with, but I think we were also responding to the fact that we felt that culturally magazines like Contrastus and Chapman spoke to a much kind of older audience and didn't really feel that they spoke to contemporary Scotland in the late 90s. You know, they would have feature articles all about, you know, Hugh McDermott and stuff, and it was all kind of referencing stuff from much earlier in Scottish history and cultural history. Looking back at it, Red Herring had features on the early days of the Scottish Parliament, Toxic Scotland, Jean Rafferty on prostitution, Claire Prentice, who would then go on to edit the List, interviewing John Collins, the Scotland player, as well as Tom McGrath. We had a review section which had stuff about the Beta Band, Celtic Connections, Geopoetics, and New Theatre from Stephen Greenhorn. And Product kind of followed that structure, having, you know, the political stuff at the front and the cultural stuff in the review section. There were other magazines around at that time, but very little that seemed to have any real profile. I remember Variant magazine, which ran from 1984 to 2012, was inspirational, although it was pretty kind of hardcore, intellectual, and kind of completely uncompromising in terms of design. It was just like a wall of text. And there was a magazine called The Cut that ran from 1986 to 1989 that was interesting and good, but that mixed kind of cultural commentary and politics. But it again went under. And I think looking at this time as well, the Sunday Herald launched in 1999. And at this time, you know, the internet was coming online, but I had a note somewhere that in 1993, 1% of information flowed through the internet, and by 2000 it was 51%. So we're kind of really at the beginning only of that phase. Looking back as well at the Red Herring and Product, there was little talk really about independence. Independence wasn't really a major driving issue in 1999, and it's kind of incredible to think about that and that arc of 20 years, because it's kind of a yawning gap when you look back, but it wasn't the issue. So I think if we look back and think, well, what have we gained? Obviously, we've gained a transformation in distribution, and you know, the print production cost and the distribution stranglehold, plus the difficulty of getting advertising into these magazines, made viability extremely difficult. So the best article in terms of distribution that Bella has published would be tens of thousands more than the highest ever print run of Product, without almost any of the costs. But I think that we've maybe lost something as well, because I think that publishing in print, in a physical print copy, does have a different kind of quality to it. I think it does have more weight, it does have more credibility and authority to it. And that's partly perception, but it's partly what the writer and the editor puts into that content. I think also that I've published every day for since 2007, whereas magazines would either be, or the magazines that I were involved in would either be monthly or bi-monthly or quarterly. So by nature, they have a completely different outlook. They would be long form, they would be much more reflective, and they'd be taking a broader, wider view rather than instant responses. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about how we write and how we perceive that. I think also echoing what Jamie said, you know, we have seen the partial collapse of print journalism as well as its re-emergence and an online variation. And as well as Bella, I would say that new publications such as the Ferret are genuinely new phenomenon that play an excellent role. And I also picked out Nutmeg as well, which has emerged as a print magazine, and it's got a specialist audience, and it's a football magazine. It's almost like the reboot of the fanzine. We've also really seen the death of the list through the coronavirus experience, but also the continued presence of the skinny. There are issues there about at what point you have the kind of volunteer ethic, and that's amateurism in the best sense, which has continued a lot of publications over many years, and at what point that becomes exploitative. We've also seen the collapse of the Sunday Herald, and then we've seen the rise and disappearance of Common Space. I think it's interesting that we've seen very little really in the way of video journalism yet. We have got the Scotia and there was Phantom Power, but these seem kind of like partial and peripheral in a sense. We've also seen the emergence of broadcasting Scottish media, you know, for years through the 80s and 90s, the idea of a Scottish Six, a dedicated TV channel or a dedicated Scottish news programme, was a sort of symbolic media icon that people thought was going to, you know, win democracy. And now we have it and people are like, yeah. So it's funny how those victories and those battles are lost and won, and how that's perceived. So I think Bella launched in 2007, and some of the themes and obsessions of mine are continuous through this period. We did for a long time have a print publication with the National as a supplement to the Sunday National, and then that went when they changed their approach, their subscription model. So I'm really interested in hearing people's reflections on this time and the space, and I hope Lesley can join us, but very interested to hear people's thoughts and questions.
Thank you very much, Mike. We're still working on Lesley, but we'll let you know. I may have to record that separately if we can't pull it together here. That's a really fascinating overview of the more recent period, thinking about the 1990s to the present. And there's that curious window. I moved to Scotland in around 2000, 2001. And it is a little bit difficult to imagine a cultural and political sphere in which the question of independence wasn't central. And it wasn't really even a reference point at the start of the millennium. And it was around the time that Bella launched, and I'm sure that's not a coincidence, that it became a much stronger kind of reference point around which other questions kind of orbited. And now we're at a stage where sometimes I feel that's kind of gone so far in the direction of hyper-partisan media that it's difficult to kind of separate media platforms from a kind of activist position within the constitutional debate, which has certainly sustained some of those platforms, but also kind of had other dimensions of media and other functions of media swallowed up by the demands of keeping a core audience satisfied, an audience who identify politically with a particular masthead and its mission. I'm thinking back to Jamie's opening remarks and thinking about what might possibly be a way forward for the Scottish media, and the question of public subsidy often comes up. I thought maybe we could begin thinking about the cultural and political intersections of these magazines through the question of subsidy, because one of the things that's very interesting about those magazines in the 60s and 70s, and then pulling right through into the millennium, is how they are cross-subsidized with cultural production through ultimately British arts funding. So the best example here is Scottish International, which is invented, which is simply a creature of the Scottish Arts Council at the time at which it becomes much more wealthy and deep-pocketed and ambitious. And that causes a lot of friction among earlier magazines and editors who've been grafting away for pennies, and suddenly this sort of Cadillac, very well-supported and well-resourced magazine emerges from nowhere, and it carries a whiff of a kind of cushy establishment organ, because it's clearly coming from a boardroom in its first instance rather than from the grassroots. But the way that that was funded was through arts funding. So we think of Scottish International, I would say, as a cultural magazine with quite a lot of politics in it. If you think about some of the events toward the end of its run in 1973, they put on this huge What Kind of Scotland event, which is like this almost kind of festival of political radicalism that includes a lot of culture, and that's where the first performance of the Cheviot the Stag and the Black Oil takes place. All of that activity is supported by public funding of artistic production. So nearly all the magazines we've mentioned will have had some small grant from the Scottish Arts Council to produce new works of literature, usually poetry, sometimes short stories. And that's clearly an important source of funding for a great many of them. But it exists in a kind of tension with some of the political aims and political ambitions of these magazines. And you don't have to dig very far in the archive of the letters to find people in virtually all of these magazines being a little concerned about how the Arts Council might respond to this or that controversy or this or that text appearing in the magazine. And that's just a thought on one mechanism of public subsidy that has been effective to a degree in the past, which doesn't really operate in that way now. Creative Scotland has a different approach to supporting cultural magazines that is more about keeping a certain number of them reasonably well-funded and sustainable, rather than giving out small amounts of money as annual grants to quite a wide range of magazines, some of which would really surprise you today. There's some very radical magazines saying really outlandish things that are publicly supported in the 1970s. Anyway, that's just an opening thought for me on the question of public subsidy. There's a whole range of issues that Jamie and Mike have helped to open out. Does anyone have a question at this stage?
Just one point, Scott. I take your point with Scots International, but Radical Scotland got some money from the Arts Council. It was minimal, and it was just then handed out to people writing short stories and people writing poetry. There was no financial benefit. It was more a status thing in the sense of having that resource, and that allowed a bit of the magazine space to be created, and therefore we encroached into the arts side, which the other magazines were very much arts with a bit of politics, whereas we saw ourselves as being politics with a bit of arts. But also, taking on Mike's point, it was about trying to find new writers. That was the focus, because I found it personally quite difficult to read Contrastus or New Edinburgh Review. There was so much, as you say, harking back. And I think the harking back was this, I keep going back to Murray Grigor and his wife's fantastic exhibition, Scotch Myths. And I think that was quite a fundamental debate point as to where does politics and arts fit. And it spun off so many discussions, debates and arguments. I think you can see in Edinburgh Review or New Edinburgh Review, I think, and also a number of other magazines, that whole thing about Tartanry, McDermott, what was Scottish identity was actually quite instrumental in the early 80s. You know, that opened up a massive debate and discussion. And at the same time, I think arts entities, particularly theatre, and you're starting to get, you know, Wildcat, you got the basis of a Scottish National Theatre kind of struggling about. And that was an iconic thing that people wanted. Now we've got it. Well, was it such a great thing? You know, in a sense, you've got to start looking at some of these shibboleths. And there was also a great debate about the Scottish Arts Council basically being a British imperial project which had come through, what do you call him, the guy, you know, the guy that saved the world with, what do you call it, his monetary policy, trying to think, famous English economist and arts, who was he? You know, Keynes, exactly. So we had a few debates about this Keynesian imperial model of the arts, and should we be subsidized? You know, the subsidies was the high arts. Should we be agreeing with that? And I remember that piece that was criticising the Arts Council. There was a bit of discussion as to whether this would end our Arts Council funding, but it was so insignificant, it didn't matter a fuck. So that, you know, that we just went with it. So in a sense, it never constrained what we wanted to do. It was a useful addition. It introduced, and to be quite blunt, it probably gave a few women an opportunity to come into these magazines, because actually you're completely right. It was male stale. Well, we weren't that stale. We hadn't got to stale, but it was largely male, and there was very few women involved. That's partly our issue, but that also, I think, the type of hackery that we were involved in didn't necessarily encourage many women to get involved. You know, it was very much a student type of engagement, and we were of an age where, you know, we were all single, so I presume we were a particularly attractive bunch of people to be seen with. So yeah, I look back on a lot of the articles and I am quite shocked. It just, you know, there are quite a number of women contributing in the magazines, but they are very much a minority. And again, completely right, the number of people contributing was limited. But if you're actually having to find people on a telephone and then get a copy posted in, there's no way you could, you know, you could rely on people. And often people didn't pitch up and you had to write an article to fill that space. So that's the nature of, so technology changed that, you know, waiting for people to post stuff in, phoning them up. You know, it was just, it's a different era in that sense. The technology, as Mike said, is fundamental and changed. And also the point about voluntarism, you know, this was completely voluntary. There was no money to be made. Marxism today thought we had money. We'd had nothing. You know, there wasn't a bean. It was just people doing it out of, you know, it was a substitute for most of us from politics, because most of us had been chucked out of the SNP. You know, and we'd set up 79 Group News and we wanted a magazine and we followed through. Kevin Dunyan was 79 Group. He had been the union negotiator type person in the SNP. You know, Liam Hamilton came in, you know, a whole range of different people came in, but they all came in from a political. So as far as Radical Scotland's concerned, it was very much a political project, and the magazine was a mechanism to allow us to engage in a politics which we were denied from the SNP.
And then that's one of the most striking things about that magazine, is that it has quite a clear sense of its own strategic aims, almost from the start, or at least from the restart. They're quite open in editorials in Radical Scotland about what they're trying to do in building a consensus for devolution on the left of the Labour Party, crossing the bridge into the SNP and so on. Your thoughts on the gender imbalance of that magazine here on our accidental manel are very apropos, and that's a real running theme throughout the work we've done on the network. If anyone's curious about that, we've tackled this a little bit in the case of Edinburgh Review. If you go to our blog and look at Jenny Turner's piece on Edinburgh Review, that's a really interesting exploration of that, and it's something we'll be revisiting in the edited book that will emerge from this in due course. I think Malcolm has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. And I kind of was just picking up on some of the things that I guess both Mike and Jamie had mentioned, but also what Douglas has just said. I'm kind of loath, as somebody who works in a university, to kind of layer a lament about the state of universities on top of a lament about the state of Scottish media. But I wonder if some of the stuff we're talking about funding, I guess how much of that magazine culture of the 60s, 70s, 80s was kind of contingent upon a certain model of university funding as well. which allowed students and I guess staff to sort of different extents the space and the kind of financial ability. You know, if Douglas is saying the Arts Council funding was kind of, you know, a wee bit extra on top, but the nature of student funding perhaps meant that people had more time than they do now. And kind of Mike's point about, you know, there is that blurred line between sort of volunteering and exploitation of people's kind of spare time. But I think, you know, like different models of student funding kind of allowed for. I mean, I know that the Scottish International is a sort of distinctive case, but I was struck by the number of addresses in your adverts that were so, you know, whatever number Buccleuch Place, you know, like there's a kind of real sort of centering around, I guess, particularly Edinburgh University for some of these things. But that sort of student culture of publications and having the kind of scope to engage in these magazines, I mean, I guess like from 2021, it doesn't really feel like students have the same time, financial scope to do that kind of work. I'm not sure.
No, I think that's right. And the dimension of staff contribution is really obvious as well. You can see, I suppose, with the rise of ref and so on, you see fewer academics and lecturers popping up with these things. But if you think of, you know, figures like Edward Morgan, Cairns Craig, I could go on and on and on. There's a lot of jobbing academics who are regular contributors in these magazines, not just writing reviews, but like really detailed articles and disseminating their own scholarship through them. You know, the sort of thing we would now call impact was happening in these magazines. And then things got a bit more involuted as research assessment took on its own features. We've covered some of the practicalities and the financial constraints under which these magazines operated. If I could come back to Jamie's initial impulse not to get too lamentful and not to get too declinist in our view of the kind of broader development of Scottish media over this period, I wonder if we could maybe look on the bright side of what these magazines achieved, and not just their successors, but I'm very struck by the actual weight and influence that they had despite their very small size in the period in which they were active. And if you go down the mastheads of these magazines, particularly Radical Scotland and Contrastus, it's kind of astonishing the number of people who came through them and were brought together by them. An immense amount of talent that later went on to big things in media, in politics, in government, in academia. These were heavyweight people, really at the start of their careers, collaborating in this very kind of undefined way, somewhere in between, as we say, volunteering, activism, apprenticeship, but with a lot of self-directed activity that didn't have any immediate financial rewards or apparent career rewards. And it's worth just celebrating the commitment people put into this work, because as you go back through it, you can't help but marvel at not only the amount of work, but the quality of the work that they did. So I'm giving a kind of round of applause to everybody involved. Douglas, if you want to take a bow on behalf of all these contributors, you're permitted that.
I just say the point about universities, that's a really good point, because in a sense, most of us that were in Radical Scotland at the start, because Radical Scotland existed and we were invited to take it over. So there was 2 issues of Radical Scotland. We came in and then we relaunched it and everybody went, oh, there's a new magazine. But it was Crantara beforehand. It'd been run by Norman Easton up in Aberdeen. So we came in, but most of us were, well, Jim Smith, myself, we were PhD students. James Robertson was PhD student. Yeah, quite a few other people were students. So we had the time. I think some people were sabbaticals, so they actually had resources. So student unions, you know, if you had a sabbatical, you had Gustetner machine, you had badge making machine, you know, and you also had the facility to get minibuses. You know, that's one of Dan told stories about the 79 group. The only reason the 79 group was Republican was that we got a minibus from Glasgow University full of students from Glasgow University who were Republicans, and we went along and they had a meeting in the Belfast Hotel and we voted for the Republican side of it. That caused a lot of grief with a lot of people. But that was the only reason. And had the student union, had we not had a sabbatical, had we not had the minibus, we wouldn't have, that bit of Scottish political history wouldn't have been there. However, the other thing is the resources, because the reason they're in Buccleuch Place, or is it Buccleuch Place, is because Edinburgh University Press was based there. They therefore had a typesetting machine, and you had to do everything on a typesetting machine. So you had to get bromides made, and the guy that was the typesetter from Edinburgh University Press would typeset the magazine and most other magazines. If he was on a good day, because if you didn't get the typesetting done by 12 o'clock, he went to the pub on a Saturday and he got pissed and you were fucked. So in a sense, there was all that side of it. So you needed the resources, and that meant we also had offices to meet in. So Edinburgh University Press, I don't think Edinburgh University knew we were using their premises, you know, and in a sense, that's the other thing, is how you could get access to these resources, because we had to have a whole weekend laying out the magazine, cutting the bromides with scalpels and then using spray mount and getting quite high on that and sticking it all down. So the technical side, it was 2 monthly, but it took a whole weekend, Friday, Saturday and Sunday, to lay it out. And then it got sent away to the printers. So you're right about the fact that universities had resources that we could use, but it's also right that students had an income. You weren't taking out a loan to do your university education. You had grants. So that is a big, big change. And I don't think that's probably reflected in much of the discussion. You know, good for students to have grants and good for postgraduate students, in my case, to go on for 8 years. So
yeah, so it is a world that is centered very much on university life, and therefore a certain part of the population.
Yeah.
And that was a kind of a select world in which this media could operate. And you can see some of the other developments politically in that period that are moving among the same strata and some of the same people. Well, do we have other thoughts or comments on the production of these magazines? Does anyone have any memories of reading them or picking them up, or of them being around the house, for example, when you grew up? It's always interesting to hear about the sort of back office, getting high on spray mount side of things, where these magazines came from. But something that, in fact, the editors of these magazines are often very curious about as they write their reports to the Arts Council is, who reads the thing? What impact does it make? What kind of a dent or a splash does it make on the great public mind out there? Does anyone remember what it was like to read and consume this media?
Well, it is interesting. I was looking at Calgacus, and you were talking about some of the heavyweights. You know, there's editions that have Tom Nairn, James Hunter, Sorley MacLean, Laurie Flynn, George Rosey in them, and there's some quite big heavy hitters. So for really small magazines, but thinking also in terms of production and who reads them, I was thinking about Variant, which was free and had a massive mailing list and went through art centres and cafes. But it was also subsidised, and it had the darkly ironic problem of, for years, publishing huge articles and issues all lambasting the Arts Council, which funded them. It was kind of at war with its funder. That was its main purpose. But again, there's that issue of, so it had a good distribution, but because it was free and didn't pay anybody. So I think what's emerging is that subsidy being withdrawn through education and through grants, but also our ability to raise some funds and then pay people. So Bell is definitely a kind of hybrid model. We couldn't exist unless people who were activists or in universities submitted articles for free, but equally we pay journalists. So we're kind of like a hybrid in between. I think it's also interesting when you look back at the Scottish Review of Books having its subsidy pooled because of the appalling comments from its editors about its problem of diversity. It is quite difficult to see the Scottish Arts Council nowadays funding Bella or an equivalent. So that's kind of to go back to Jamie's argument at the beginning, which I think is there's a strong case for that. But because politics has become so partisan and the constitutional issue is so central, it would probably be absolutely slated if it subsidised a political publication, which isn't a reason why it shouldn't, and it isn't a reason why we shouldn't argue for that. But I think that that's a reality.
Yeah, one factor there, and there's a whole article about this you can read, but I think Douglas referred earlier to the British imperial model of arts subsidy, going back to the wartime developments under Keynes. I was recently looking into this for something I'm writing, and there's some really interesting research by Susan Galloway, which kind of pushes against that to show that, kind of by accident, the Scottish Arts Council ended up being the most autonomous of any arts funding organization in the UK, because it had what she calls a double arm's length relationship to government. So the Arts Council, which was just called the Arts Council, but it was the British Arts Council, and then eventually the English Arts Council, was notionally insulated from political interference. But then the Scottish sort of satellite of that was kind of doubly insulated, and they could do whatever they wanted, and they were really only accountable to themselves. And it's kind of a brief window in which, not that they got away with murder, but if you look back at some of the material they were subsidizing in the 1970s, under a lot of pressure, because they made a lot of enemies by founding Scottish International, which was viewed very suspiciously as a kind of anti-nationalist organ by people like Hugh McDermott and his followers. But pretty soon, Scottish Arts Council is funding on a small scale magazines like Scotia, which becomes Scotia Review, which is full of like unpublishable things today, but it's being subsidized by the public purse in that period. And there's a kind of irony in that as devolution, political devolution, concentrates more power in democratically accountable hands in Scotland, that becomes a lot riskier. That's somebody's name has signed off on that, who is accountable. And in fact, there's probably less scope and less freedom to do edgy publishing on public subsidy today than in the 1970s.
Yeah, and going back to the Scottish Review of Books controversy, it's funny because it was subsidised for a very long time, edited by a married couple who had absolutely no concept of the need for diversity in their writers at all, which is odd, but I think speaks more about establishment Scotland and the networks that still exist.
Okay, well, do we have any other particular questions or issues people want to explore further? I see very belatedly Rory Scowthorne has graced us with his presence. Rory recently completed a PhD on this exact topic, but didn't turn up for this. Rory, let's hear your excuse and then hopefully a few comments.
My excuse is that I thought this was at 6 because it's on the 6th. And my PhD didn't have many numbers in it. So that's my excuse. I can chip in, but I might cover ground that has already been.
By all means, please do.
Well, the thing that I'm very interested in is how the format of political writing, the way in which it's actually carried and distributed and produced up to a point, shapes the kind of ideological content of that writing. So what's the difference between the kind of ideologies that emerge from a political culture or a radical political culture that's founded in magazine production, or one that's founded in, for instance, blogging and social media, because you have very different structures of power that are encouraged by those different structures. So if you have a magazine, you're quite likely to have a more fixed editorial structure. You have stronger bottlenecks for content basically than you do with social media. Social media doesn't have an editor. This is what's so terrible about it, is that there's no content control at all, no quality control. You can, and the kind of false egalitarianism that it produces means that people, if they can perform the kind of the rhetoric of expertise in their tweets, if they can sound like they know what they're talking about, they can get away with accruing a degree of authority to an opinion that's founded on almost nothing whatsoever. And that authority would normally be handed down to someone within a magazine by the editor. The editor would go, yes, you sound like you know what you're talking about, and I have a legitimate authority in this institution to tell our readers that you know what you're talking about. So that authority then accrues to the person that published in the pages of the magazine. In social media, there's no one to do that. The authority that someone can claim in saying anything is entirely determined by what is essentially a market mechanism, by what is the interplay of various, fads and trends online, which nobody's in any kind of control of except the people that run Twitter. It's algorithmic at best, or it's run by some guy in an office in California. And that's, I think, a step backwards for any kind of democratic public sphere. I think one of the big things that's basically gone wrong with left media in particular is the loss of centralized forms of authority, such as even editorial collectives are significantly better than the kind of total anarchy that a kind of digital public sphere provides. And so political websites like Bella Caledonia, for instance, are a kind of bulwark against that kind of thing, because at least we've got Mike doing a bit of editing. So I definitely think that it's really important in these questions to address the format and the location of authority and how authority is produced within that format in all kinds of political publishing.
Yeah, that's interesting. And of course, in some of these magazines, the sorts of editorial authority you're referring to, which is kind of curatorial as well as you were saying, giving a kind of quality control, seal of approval to various writing ideas, is intermixed with a kind of political authority. Because so many of these magazines, as you have said, Rory, are also platforms for political organization and platforms for political communication. And so editorial authority and then political leadership get kind of mixed up together. And I wonder if that was the case with some of the political magazines we were discussing earlier, like Radical Scotland, where there is clearly, as Douglas was saying, people with a political background who are used to being in political organizations who then take their activism into the pages of a periodical. Douglas, do you want to comment on that?
Rory's point is very good, because I think one of the things that's different is there was the editorial board meeting. Although the magazine came out once every 2 months, that would be planned over a longer period. So you would make pitches. So there would be about 10 or 12 people making pitches, and there would be an argument and a discussion. So there was a theme technically within the magazines. So you were looking for articles on a particular theme. So you had decided that there was an issue you wanted to look at, then who could we get to write? And obviously that was limited to the people that we knew. So therefore, in a sense, we had to be better networked to know people. But also I think the political time is different, because we were trying to create linkages across, because as far as we were concerned, the SNP was dead. It had decided to go down a fundamentalist route, independence, nothing less. There was no role for us if we believed in some form of self-government. So we needed to make links with a whole range of other people. So therefore, part of the magazine, which radical magazine these days, off the left, say, would go and interview Malcolm Rifkind or George Younger, or that, in a sense, there was an attempt to try and make bridges, but also then create news so that other media would pick it up. Whereas in a sense now you're instantaneous. I suppose it's a bit like Spotify. We were trying to develop LPs and they're looking at single sales. And that's different. You know, there's a different argument there. And that, as I say, it was a political project to try and build links across. It wasn't to try and reinforce a particular strategy or a particular position. And I think that that's a different world now.
Rory? And then Mike.
Yeah, one thing that jumps out at me from a lot of these magazines is specifically the encounters of people involved with these magazines and the ideas generated in these magazines, the encounters of those things with politics, is that if you build a political community around print culture, which I think is sort of what happened on the left, on the kind of more nationalist inclined bits of the left in the 70s, if you try and build a kind of alternative political community around print culture, the perception of kind of what's possible is quite strongly affected by this. And this is kind of the, I guess this is kind of the point Benedict Anderson makes in Imagined Communities, but at a smaller level, if your idea of, or if your ideas are being formed in a space that is relatively deliberative and slow and allows people to treat each other with good faith, you have the kind of process of the editorial board, you have trust in the institution, and then you take those ideas that have been developed and refined in that space into politics, they suddenly hit this kind of much faster running stream and get completely carried away and warped out of all recognition. And I think there's something very interesting that happens in bridging that gap between basically the two different speeds of politics for these people. That you look at something like the Scottish Labour Party, where a bunch of intellectuals go into this, having refined some ideas in a slower and more discursive and didactic realm of life, and they suddenly are dealing with what they call the kind of Ayrshire socialists and Jim Sillars, who's purging people left, right, and centre, and they can't keep up, and it's a really unpleasant experience for a lot of these people, who are forced to pick between the Sillarsites, who are pretty hard line and old school, and these Trotskyist entryists who also seem to be from a different kind of culture, and get torn, and this kind of nice literary intelligentsia gets torn between these two wings and can't really sustain itself. And again, I think you see that happening again now in a different way, where people whose political ideas are basically formed on social media come into contact with actual political reality and find it a really traumatic ordeal. They find it really, really unpleasant. They go, why? This reality must bend to my experience, rather than me realizing that the space in which I formed these ideas is wholly incompatible with this massive thing that is electoral politics. That's way beyond anyone's kind of didactic reach, the kind of processes that you cultivate in magazines. So again, I think bridging those gaps between different speeds of political thought and action is one of the really interesting things that you get from studying magazines, and that you start to notice when you look at how these magazines respond to events and their own their members' engagement with events.
Interesting. Let's hear from Mike and then Malcolm.
Yeah, I was interested in that idea from Rory about centralization and editorialship, and the issue of gender here. Because that issue between what's emerged as blogging and the blogosphere, which is different from an editorial board or an editorial collective, and lends itself to what Mark Fisher called the solitary urinal of male subjectivity. And I think that there's something really terrible about what's happened in creating the blogosphere, rather than this concept that we've completely unsuccessfully championed for years, which is this idea of the fifth estate, which is kind of networked, empowered citizens publishing in various forms. And the difference between that concept and the sort of vibe and feel and tone of that versus the blogosphere, which is relentlessly single white men, is very different.
Malcolm?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of pick up on a couple of points, but I guess what I was kind of thinking was, and I'm guilty of this in the sense that I'm really like a political historian, so I tend to be interested in the kind of people who wrote for the magazines and the kind of arguments they had. But I guess it's something we haven't really mentioned is about the audience and how that has changed. I am maybe still interested in what Mike has to kind of say about this, because I think, so like picking up on what Rory said about social media, but like the magazines that we've looked at from the 60s, 70s, 80s, I don't think I'm being too unfair if I'm saying like they're kind of pitched student-y, academic, political activists. It's a kind of small, relatively enclosed world, and within that they can have success. I mean, like obviously, as you kind of mentioned, Radical Scotland and kind of Douglas's work, you know, like had a specific political intention and was pretty successful in a lot of ways in achieving it. I guess what we've got now is speaking, like, for better or worse, to a much broader audience in a lot of ways. I'm thinking, you know, like Mike mentioned, the National, which is something we haven't really talked about, but that, you know, or mentioned like the Scottish Six and stuff like, you know, like things that maybe people had argued in favour of, like a pro-independence newspaper, a dedicated Scottish news. These are things that we now have, but I'm sensing from some comments that were maybe like uncertain about the benefits of some of the changes that have come about. So I mean, I wondered if people had kind of thoughts about audience reach, who's reading this. I don't want to upset Scott by raising wings over Scotland, but like that, you know, like that kind of, yeah, single white men kind of perspective on some of this that's kind of shifted maybe the kind of tone and the audience and how the debate's conducted.
At long last, a relief from male speakers, much to everybody's relief. Glenda.
Yeah, I thought you needed one female voice on the video if you're recording this. Yeah, I mean, I suppose just picking up on the last couple of points, one thing I was thinking about was just, as everyone was talking, what a tight sense of lineage there was. And all of your speakers, you know, were saying, well, we reacted against this and this was in dialogue with that. And I think that's very particular characteristic of say, up to the 1990s, as you're talking, that sense of actually quite tight groups who, and you're talking about readership, I think quite often these people are reading each other's magazines, and that constitutes quite a large body of the readership. Yeah, so that's very sort of, I mean, in a way, it's a very productive kind of dialogue, but it's a dialogue that is based, I think, a lot upon a strong sense of difference and lineage and so on. And I think, going back to what Rory was saying about social media, that's presumably what's lost, isn't it? There isn't that sense of, if you say something within, if you write something, if you publish something within that fairly enclosed world and as part of that lineage, then in a way you're taking responsibility, aren't you, for what you're saying, whereas actually posting something on social media, there is no responsibility, is there? You don't really need to be identifying yourself in the way that I think once upon a time you would do, whether you were reacting against the dead hand of McDermott or whatever.
Yes, and as that side of online journalism fragments even further with the rise of Substack and other platforms, there's really no accountability to anything larger than the individual. The individual journalist is their own editor, is their own brand, and is their own subscriber base. So there's even less of a sense of responsibility to a collective or to a title or its traditions. And it feels much more atomistic in that regard. But yeah, maybe the kind of knitting together and centralizing functions of established bodies have something to be said for them. Rory?
Apologies if this might be one of the things you've said already, but in terms of that point about audience, and the ability or the ability to keep things within, you know, a particular community that Glenda was talking about. The political economy of this stuff is so vital that you know, it is so much harder to sustain any kind of long form interrogation of politics, just in basic economic terms, now in a way that can justify itself, because there's so much more pressure now, I think, to be quite populist, to have reach and gain reputation and so on, and get eyeballs, because that's, you know, theoretically possible through the internet. And the thing that you're told absolutely not to do is write anything long. I'm absolutely terrible at this, and I always exceed my word count by at least double. But I think, you know, when you look at these, go through these magazines, and some of it is so dull, and but that's great. There's something incredibly utopian about this, that these people could sit and write like thousands of words about something that like no one really cared that much about, and probably very few people would read, but someone would read it and get a huge amount out of it. But and that kind of the space in which that could happen and be justifiable and be given equal status and room in a magazine with the kind of short, punchy news items has, I think, definitely declined, except for in increasingly concentrated and centralized like nodes of power and influence. So where the money still is, where you get these incredibly generous institutions that can you know, let Perry Anderson write thousands and thousands of words on a novelist. I think it was Anthony Powell. He just wrote these huge reflections on Anthony Powell. But that's in the London Review of Books. You know, you're less and less likely to be able to do that in Scotland, and there's fewer people in Scotland who are going to use their free time to set up a magazine that publishes that kind of long form stuff in the way that people were doing in the 70s. These small things, small readerships. They did have to go begging to the Arts Council for support and things, but there's a territorial pressure there now, that was there back then as well. But I think the other thing back then is that you had the kind of welfare state that gave people a bit more time and a bit less pressure to be doing something more kind of useful and populist with a broader appeal back then than you do now. So the wider story of neoliberalism is a key part of that. The fact that people are more insecure, more precarious, don't have the time to spend time on this stuff anymore. So that political economic underpinning is really, really vital to these changes as well, I think.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Can I go to Jamie first and then Mike?
Can you hear me? Sorry. Rory makes an important point about the welfare state sustaining a lot of these publications and the intellectual heavy lifting that they produced. My late dad contributed quite extensively both to Question magazine and to Radical Scotland. And one of the reasons he was able to do that was that when he was made unemployed by the SNP in the early 1980s, he just went on the dole, and he wrote a lot during that period. And there is no equivalent for journalists of my generation and Rory's generation. It's really just moving from one precarious commission to the next. So yeah, I think the absence of sustainable public funding and state support is extremely problematic for the next generation of publications coming through. The inheritor, we talked about Bella Caledonia as an inheritor, the natural inheritor to publications like Radical Scotland and Question. It's worth discussing at some point what comes after Bella.
Cheery thought, Mike.
Yeah, can't contemplate that one. I was thinking about this issue of audiences though, and reach and populism, because I think it was Rory made the point about when that interacts with reality. I mean, the Stuart Campbell's blog had huge audiences, had huge readership, very successful at raising hundreds of thousands of pounds of other people's money, but ultimately is politically inert, and is literally wrote its final blog saying, "I don't really know what to do with all this money," and that's kind of like that's a hilarious outcome of this kind of silo culture that was created. So it was huge audiences of people who all agreed with themselves, and that's completely inert. It's a sort of stale, soiled cult that doesn't actually have any political impact whatsoever. So there's that dichotomy between, you could have publications with smaller audiences but with much more impact, but we measure thing in, look, this is massive readership. It's completely inert.
And I think there's a broader point there, without wishing to offend anybody. One of the most lamentable legacies of the Yes movement is those kind of hot-housed fandoms where it's not really functioning like an audience for political discourse that wants to debate anything. It wants to have its own views and prejudices affirmed and repeated and celebrated in a way that is very intolerant of questions or revisions or anything other than a kind of cheerleading. And I do wonder about this highly committed audience, which is the core audience for some of these platforms, especially if they have commercial ambitions or marketing responsibilities, that they're not really engaging with a political audience as was understood in the 70s or 80s. They're trying to satisfy fans who are hooked on something. And that's quite a different thing. Douglas.
The point about long form writing, you're completely right, because there is nothing in Scotland. So academic articles, academic journals, you know, that there's an article that you referenced that I wrote in your book, Scott, which was written in 2013, I think. And you know, it was Scottish Affairs rejected it. So it was just a review. We'd been invited to talk about Radical Scotland. But where else do you publish? You know, Scottish Affairs seemed to be the place. It wouldn't publish it because Lindsay Patterson didn't like what I said about Radical Scotland because he was involved in it later. I didn't know he was involved in it later because I'd left it by that stage. So he felt that his contribution to the world wasn't there. So it didn't get published. So, you know, where else do you publish it? Bella wouldn't want it because it's far too long and dull. You know, it's a niche thing. You know, you can see there's 6 or 7 of us here talking about it. But the other side, I think, in a sense, is who was the audience? Well, I think in the case of Radical Scotland, and I think in some of the other cases, it was a very elite-focused idea. We just wanted to target certain key politicians and create the illusion that there was political pressure. So we had to have the magazine in Waverley Station, and we had to have it in Queen Street Station, and that's all it ever, and a few left-wing bookshops, and we sold it outside political meetings. We went along, so it looked as though this magazine existed in a lot of places, but it didn't. And the idea was just targeting, trying to change people's minds. Now that's a different sort of entity again than now. And I suppose the poetry magazines, Edinburgh Review, the Chapman, they were obviously targeting because they wanted their poetry or their writing to be taken seriously. And I think for a younger generation now, it is actually, you know, all credit to the guys here who are publishing in different outlets, because it must be bloody hard to get, you know, there compared to in the past where, you know, a homemade publication could actually get something. You don't have that. And a blog is not a replacement for that. You know, you need to have an audience in some respects, and a magazine created an audience. That's me done.
No worries, Douglas. Rory, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I almost completely forgot what I was going to say because I was so excited by what Douglas just said about kind of inventing the kind of illusion of political pressure happening, which is a fascinating point. But one interesting counterexample, again, sorry if this has already been said, for finding an audience is the West Highland Free Press, where they were extremely explicit from. So I mean, these Dundee University grads, Brian Wilson, put on some gigs, raised some money, incredibly financially precarious from the start. Eventually managed to get a Highlands and Islands Development Board grant, a bit of support for printing and things. But when they started out, they were very, very keen to embed themselves in the kind of everyday concerns of a non-political audience and a non-ideological audience. And so you see kind of, it's got incredibly banal stuff. It's got like the fairy times and stuff in it. What they basically did is they identified a popular niche, a niche for actual popular demand in a particular area that was simply not being served for like really basic news and the kind of journalism as public, or print culture as public service that was going on on Sky. And from there, and so on. Yes, Jonathan Wills and Orkney did the same, and Jonathan Wills, but like the Dundee graduates going to the West, Jonathan Wills went up from Edinburgh Uni, where he was this brilliant cartoonist. And so you have these university graduates going, hang on, keeping this within the kind of university hothouse doesn't work. If you want to get a kind of sustainable project, what we have to do is embed it in a place that needs print culture, that actually where everybody needs a kind of print cultural resource that isn't there. And so the West Highland Free Press, and then they tried to do it with Scotland with this thing called 7 Days, which was a weekly newspaper that tried to basically do the same thing. It had like sports and stuff in it. But that failed pretty quickly. It lasted a few years. And I think part of that is because Scotland already had a press, and Sky, I mean, they were competing with other publications on Sky, but it was a much more carefully targeted niche. So it's worth thinking about those magazines that did try to produce something beyond mere politics, or those the ways in which they tried to expand their audience in recognition that not everyone wants to read about politics all the time.
Indeed. My connection's getting a little bit ropey, and I'm a bit nervous of losing the recording. So let me go to Jamie, and then I'll ask for some final thoughts.
And just to pick up again on Rory's point, we lose a lot by focusing obsessively on the decomposition of the national press, and the ever declining circulation rates of the Herald and the Scotsman, or the collapse of the Scottish Review of Books. If you look beyond the Central Belt to the East Coast, the press and Journal and the Courier are doing pretty well by any standard. I also, just to go back to what something Mike mentioned, I think this feeds into my central point about the sort of anarchic diversity of Scottish media culture, independence and otherwise. He mentioned a bunch of magazines that I hadn't heard of, and I mentioned a bunch of magazines that he hadn't heard of. I think that just underlines the centrality of not being over focused once again on these declinist narratives when it comes to the Scottish media, and remembering that there are constantly new magazines, new ideas, new blogs bubbling up all the time. And that's why I came into this event expecting to be relentlessly pessimistic, and found myself feeling unexpectedly optimistic about the future of the Scottish media.
Well, that does seem a nice, happy way to conclude, unless we have any final thoughts. Viewers of the video, we had hoped to host Lesley Riddoch, who is going to talk about harpies and quines, among other things, but we'll try and get that content to you separately. Final thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting just to pick up that 2 points. One that Douglas mentioned about the kind of illusion of having a magazine out there, and when we did Red Herring and Product, that was also the tactic to be in the John Menzies of Waverley and Queen Street Station, which were because that was the hubs of people getting on the trains between Edinburgh and Glasgow. That is how you created a magazine network. And at that time, and that's interesting because it's so relentlessly Central Belt. And I think one of the things that has I think that's one of the things that was great about Calgakis, because it was Highland, radical Highland publication. And I think it's one of the things that is liberatory about the new technology, is that we can have, I've got a Gaelic columnist in Uist, and I've got writers throughout the world, but throughout Scotland. So it can smash through that central belt focus.
Yeah, whatever else. I mean, there's different kinds of narrowness, but that sense of there being a very small social world reflected in these magazines, I think that has pretty much gone. That's certainly a positive. You wouldn't know that from the membership of this small group today, but it is a bit more diverse than it was. With that, I think I will close. Thank you very much to Jamie and Mike, our speakers today, and for everyone who turned up. That was a really stimulating discussion that helps us think a bit further about how to connect this, I think, really impressive magazine heritage to some of the issues currently facing Scottish media. Look out for our next event, which will be circulated in the usual places, and we'll look forward to seeing you again. Thanks very much.